So I can stop thinking about it. In fact, I think I need to. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel, Just Another Struggling Writer, the beleaguered author's one-stop shop for commiseration and hopefully inspiration. My name is Carrie Scher, and I am just another struggling writer. Today I am doing a new kind of video, something I've never even tried before on my own, and that is a tier ranking. And what I'm going to be tier ranking for you guys is all the books I read in the first quarter of 2024. For me, that was 22 books. But I thought it would be a little boring to just tier rank them based on my star ratings, so I'm going to be doing it a little bit differently, and I've come up with some categories to sort these books into that might give you a little bit of a different idea of what I thought of them and what you might think of them. So as you can see here, the top ranking is I Can't Stop Thinking About It, and that's exactly what it sounds like. Whether I thought it was a good book or a bad book or it's somewhere, I can't stop thinking about these books for whatever reason. Either they're making me angry, or I really love the writing or the characters or something about it, or I just loved it outright. Either way, this tier is for those books that I'm still thinking about weeks and months later. The second tier is entertaining, and that's exactly what it sounds like. I didn't think it was perfect. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. I thought it was entertaining. The middle tier is not what I expected. And again, that could be good or bad. That could be, I was expecting it to disappoint me and I really enjoyed it. Or opposite, I thought I would love it and it disappointed me instead. Or I just had completely different expectations and this book was not at all what I thought it was. So this second to last tier is not for me. And again, just what it sounds like. These are books that I may not have enjoyed, but I can definitely see what the appeal is. And this is just a matter of taste. And then lastly, books I wish I DNF'd. And there are some books on here that I did DNF, and there are books on here that I wished I didn't finish. It just, for whatever reason, I didn't like it or I thought it was a waste of my time. So those are the tiers. Let's get into the books themselves. Again, we've got 22 of them to talk about. So first up, we have Episode 13 by Craig DeLuey. And this is a horror novel about a group of paranormal investigators who are given the opportunity to investigate a house that is about to be torn down that once housed the research group, I think it's like the Paranormal Research Group or whatever foundation, and that group went missing in the 60s, and the house has had a haunted reputation ever since. And this paranormal group is able to go into this house before it is torn down and do one last investigation. And things go just about as well as you would expect for a horror novel. And I am actually going to put this in not for me, because I found when I was reading this that I might not be a horror girly, because this wasn't scary at all. I was actually really bored. And it might just be because I'm not a super visual reader. I don't really have a great theater of the mind. And so when the spooky elements started, I was just sort of like, they were just as words on a page to me. They didn't invoke any sort of creeped out feelings or anticipation or thrills or anything. I just thought it was boring. And I don't think that's necessarily the book's fault. Like, I think I would have to read more horror before I had a good understanding of whether or not this is the book or just me. So for right now, I'm putting that in not for me. Next up, we have Fevered Star, and Fevered Star is the second novel in Rebecca Roanhorse's Between Earth and Sky trilogy. I liked the first one. I liked a lot about the first one, but I also was let down by a lot about the first one. There were characters that I didn't like, characters that I absolutely loved. So I gave it, even though I liked the setting and I really liked some of the characters, I only gave it 4 stars. Fevered Star is the second one, and while I'm not going to get too much into it because of spoilers, this book is going to go in not what I expected in a good way. For a lot of this book, I thought it was mid. It definitely has some middle book syndrome. There is a lot of like traveling around and there's not tons of tension. And then we get to the end, and oh my gosh, that ending took me by surprise Not because it was surprising in and of itself that that's how it ended, but it was just so good. And it was just exactly what I wanted from the first book. And it made me excited again to read the final installment of this trilogy when it comes out later this year. And so while through most of the book, it was a solid 3 stars, that ending again bumped it up to a 4 star. So definitely not what I expected. I went into this not really excited about what I might get, but ended up at the end being extremely excited for the finale. Next up, we have Godkiller by Hannah Kaner, and I have talked about this book a lot on my channel. It is about a young woman named Kissin who is our titular Godkiller, and in this world, gods are beings who are summoned into life via prayer and offering. And at one time, these gods were widely worshipped and widely revered. However, at one time, a war broke out amongst the gods that claimed the lives of thousands of mortals, and that sort of turned the tide of popular opinion against them. And that has created a very tense situation in this kingdom. And while there were elements of Godkiller that I didn't love, I found in the end that I just could not stop thinking about it. I just was obsessed with Hannah Kaner's writing and how efficient it was and how she was able to pack such an incredible narrative punch in so few pages and gave all of her 4 POV characters complete arcs in less than 300 pages. For an epic fantasy, that is just incredible. And that is why I'm putting this in I can't stop thinking about it, because truly I can't. I want to emulate Hannah Kaner's writing so badly for myself. Next up, we have A Master of Jinn by P. Jelly Clark, and this follows a young woman named Fatma who is the only female agent at this supernatural investigation agency in Egypt in the early 1900s. And at the beginning of our story, a very wealthy white man who is the head of like this kind of occult society is quite brutally murdered, and everyone else in his group alongside him. And that triggers an investigation for Fatma because of his connections to the magical world and to the occult. And that sets off a murder mystery. I loved a lot about this book. I loved the steampunk elements. I loved the Middle Eastern setting. And I kind of liked the murder mystery plot. Where it lost me a little bit was the characters. I found Fatma to just be a little bit too silly, goofy, quirky, and everyone else in her supporting cast to be a little bit forgettable. And I also was a little bit let down by the fact that this is a companion to a previous story of P. Jelly Clark's, and it just felt a little too referential to that previous story to really suck me in. I feel like I kept getting pulled out of it because it kept referencing past events that I had no idea about. So I am going to go ahead and put this in entertaining, because I was entertained. Next up, we have Grey's Sister by Mark Lawrence, and this is the second book in his Book of the Ancestor trilogy, the first being Red Sister, which I was obsessed with and am still obsessed with to this day. I read it a couple of years ago and I gave it 5 stars. I loved it so much. I feel like it literally changed my life. And I avoided reading the second installment of this trilogy because I was so obsessed with it. I was just worried that I was going to be let down. And while Grey's Sister didn't pack the punch, the emotional punch for me that Red Sister did, I still found it a very good bridge to the third installment, Holy Sister. I loved learning more about our main character, Nona, and kind of her journey. If you're not familiar with the Book of the Ancestor, it is about, I always tell people that it's about nun assassins in a science fantasy world with an almost exclusively female cast, but really, ultimately, it's about friendship. And that holds true in Grey's Sister. So I am also going to put this one in entertaining. I only just finished it like a week and a half ago. At the moment, I can't stop thinking about it because I immediately wanted to pick up the third book, Holy Sister, and just finish out the story. For now, I'm going to leave it into entertaining because I'm not sure if I can't stop thinking about it because it was so recent. Next up, we have Leviathan Wakes. This is the first book in the much beloved Expanse series. In this book, we follow a couple of characters who have been swept up into a war between the inner planets and what is known as the Belt. That is the colonies that inhabit the asteroid belt in our solar system. There has been tension between these two groups for a long time, but when an ice mining ship is destroyed and there is evidence that points back to Mars as being the culprit, those tensions explode into all-out war. And our 2 main characters get swept up in this conflict. This book could go into a couple of different categories. It was not quite what I expected. I kind of heard it compared a lot to the Mass Effect trilogy, the video game series, which is one of my favorite video games and one of my favorite stories of all time. I didn't really feel that as much. I got a little bit of it in the second half when the alien virus storyline starts kicking off and in the hard science of it. But what I love most about Mass Effect is the characters, and I did not like the characters very much of this book. I also could put it in entertaining because when I did my call pile breakdown, my entertainment and enjoyment factor was the highest rating. I really did find the plot compelling. I liked the hard science. I liked where we were going. I was just a little bit let down by our POV characters. I didn't enjoy being in either of their heads. But where I'm ultimately going to put this is actually in, I can't stop thinking about it. As much as the characters irritated me, and as much as I was a little bit let down by certain elements of the plot, I immediately, as soon as I finished this book, I went to my Libby app and checked out the second book. I haven't gotten to it yet. It is on my list this month to continue. I do want to continue this series pretty soon, and I can't stop thinking about it, truly. Next up, we have Hall of Smoke by H.M. Long. This is a story about a young woman who at the beginning of the book has offended her goddess and is trying to atone at her shrine, but while she is away from her village, it is sacked by raiders and destroyed, and her whole life basically goes up in flames. And she is sent on this mission to kill a man and hopefully atone for offending her goddess. I really didn't like this book at all. I thought it was very boring. I thought our main character Hesso is extremely tedious, who was not just slow to absorb and act on new information, but outright ignoring it at times and stubbornly shielding herself against new information even though it would help her. The setting was forgettable, and the bad guys were forgettable, and the goals were forgettable. I could not believe that this ended up being a trilogy because it felt very nicely wrapped up at the end. I am going to put this book in I wish I DNF'd. I read this when I was gone on my Denver trip, and it took me a good 10 or 12 hours cumulatively to finish, and I just think that my time would have been better spent reading a different book. I didn't really care for it at all, and I am not at all interested in reading the sequel. Next up, we have Queen of the Conquered by Kaysen Callender, and this follows a young woman who is the only noble of color in these islands where the majority of the native population have been enslaved. And she comes from a native background. However, through a series of circumstances, she has been elevated to this noble status. And her goal is to win the king's favor and basically take over as regent. But she has to fight against all of the prejudices that the other nobles hold against her for her skin color. I didn't like it. I didn't like it, I don't think, at all. And not because of the story, but because of the craft. The writing in this book really, really bothered me because there was a plot element where our main character has a magical ability where she is able to enter anybody's minds pretty much and read their minds and remove their memories and even to a limited degree control them. And the writer used this plot device to head hop everywhere and give us information about characters and backgrounds and plot things that we didn't necessarily need to have in every scene at all times. We were just inundated with it. I think 80% of this book was narration. There was very little dialogue because the main character didn't need to have a conversation. She would just jump into their heads and take whatever information she needed and give it to us through narration. And I didn't care for that style at all. I really, really, really hated it. I am a big fan of character interaction. I think that is where the meat and potatoes of character development occurs, is when characters are interacting with each other. And she doesn't interact with anybody. She just reads their minds and moves on. And I also found just some of the narrative choices to be extremely repetitive. There wasn't a lot of plot movement or character development, and I ultimately think that this book just wasn't for me. This was a novel by a non-binary person of color, so I felt it was important for me to read in terms of diversifying my reading, because a lot of my TBR is extremely white. And I think that I could have liked this story, the unlikable main character and the kind of dark plot, but the writing choices ultimately just sunk it for me. Next up, we have Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher, and this is another entry in her World of the White Rat universe, which I really, really love. And I was so excited to get back into that world with another fantasy romance by an author who I have come to think of as one of my favorites. However, Paladin's Grace ended up disappointing me just a little bit. I didn't like either of the lead characters. I thought that the main male character was just sort of flat and boring and kind of standard issue, and the main female character was kind of annoying and wishy-washy and refused to verbalize anything and was constantly making incorrect assumptions and then getting mad about them. She just grated on me. I just didn't care for her. I liked elements of the story. T. Kingfisher's writing is always a banger. The world itself, I always really enjoy. The Temple of the White Rat, really, really fun. And I am going to be continuing on with the series, which are sort of like companion novels. But for me, this one just was not what I expected. I was expecting it to love this, and it was just a little bit disappointing. Next up, we have Piranesi by Susanna Clark, and I heard nothing but really great things about this book from reviewers that I really trust and my tastes tend to align with. And on a rainy Saturday afternoon, I laid in bed and I consumed it in one sitting. And I must say that I enjoyed it, but again, it just wasn't what I expected. The central mystery kind of let me down a little bit. The antagonist was again standard issue, and the antagonist's goals were extremely standard issue, but the main character is just so like endearing and you just want to root for him, and the mystery of his surroundings and how he came to be there I thought was really, really fascinating in a way. We read this story through his journal entries, and I really love that part of like the whole book, was seeing his like development and we are truly figuring things out as he does. I liked a lot about it, but again, it was just not what I expected and not something that I ended up truly loving. Next up, we have Starling House by Alex E. Harrow, and this is a contemporary fantasy gothic story about a young woman named Opal who is living a kind of hand-to-mouth existence with her minor brother in this Kentucky coal town, when her whole life is turned upside down when she accepts a job as a house cleaner at this spooky old manor in town. And the proprietor of the manor is a man named Arthur who has a dark secret, and of course the plot kicks off from there. Unfortunately, as interesting as that sounds on paper, as interested as I was to read it, I ended up hating it. Oh my god, I hated it so much. Opal is completely insufferable. She is a liar and a manipulator. She, on the page, admits to emotionally abusing her brother at one point. There isn't a single character that she doesn't lie to or abuse or manipulate in some way, and she never faces really any consequences for any of it, and she never really learns any lessons from it. I found the plot to be extremely boring. The fantasy elements were not well integrated into the rest of it, and also introduced way too late. The kind of semi-sentient house, I think, is a plot element that I've seen done too many times to really be impressed by, and the ending was just sort of contrived and rushed. And that is why I'm going to put it in I wish I DNF'd. Ultimately, I don't think I got anything out of it other than just a big waste of time and disappointment. Next up, we have Sunbringer by Hannah Kaner. This is the second installment in her Fallen God series, following Godkiller. And this shouldn't be any surprise that I also can't stop thinking about it. This is my first 5-star read in a couple of years, but it's been at least a year. This improved on everything I loved about Godkiller, the characters, the plot, the setting. I just loved all of it, and I still can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about it. Like, when are we gonna find out what happens to these guys? Next up, we have The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and I am going to be putting this one in Not For Me. In this book, we follow a young woman who has accepted a job onto a ship that is designed to create wormholes for interstellar travel. Through the course of this journey, she meets a lot of new characters and has a lot of new experiences. At least that's what I think happens, because I ended up DNFing this one. I mentioned it a little while ago. I don't do well with the very lighthearted, whimsical, not taking itself too seriously sort of books, as insufferable as that makes me. And this one is definitely slice of life, very lighthearted, very whimsical, and I was very bored. It just wasn't for me. I can definitely see that there is an audience for this though. But unfortunately, I am not that audience. Next up, we have The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. And this is about a young woman named Ren who has come up with a cunning plan to con her way into a noble family. However, the family she has chosen as her mark for this con is unfortunately broke, out of political favor, and has very few surviving members left, which means they don't have a lot of power left in the house. However, she's hitched her horse to this wagon and she has no choice but to try and improve their standing in the world. And through her conning and conniving and her connections to this family, she gets embroiled in a magical plot to change the balance of power in this particular city. I really loved a lot about this book. I love the main character. I kind of love her central conceit of, I am going to get rich come hell or high water, and the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to con this poor family and I'm going to get my name on their register and I'm going to use them for all they're worth. But she's also just really scrappy, and the people in her life, I find her relationship with her sister Tess to be extremely really loving and endearing. I like a lot of the character dynamics, a lot of the side characters and the peripheral characters. I loved the midpoint plot twist. It wasn't perfect by any means. It was extremely long, and the ending, I was hoping for a subverted trope and it just went all in on the trope instead. So that was a little bit disappointing, but I can't decide. I can't decide if this belongs in entertaining or I can't stop thinking about it. I finished this about 3 weeks ago. I think that's enough time to decide if I can't stop thinking about it. I think I'm going to put it in entertaining because I'm not feeling in any rush to pick up the second installment. I think it's because it was just so damn long that I need a mental break from that setting and that series and those characters before I get into another almost 700-page installment. So I can stop thinking about it. In fact, I think I need to for a little bit before I get back into it. So I'm going to leave that in entertaining. Next up, we have City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. And this was actually a reread for me because I read it in 2018, shortly after it came out. And I just didn't really love it at the time. So I forgot about it and I didn't really think about it until this year. And I was mulling it over and I decided I may have been a little bit too harsh because on paper, this book has everything I want. A strong female character, a Middle Eastern fantasy setting, political drama. So I gave it a second chance and it did improve on reread. The elements that bothered me before are still there. I still find one of the POV characters very boring. I don't care about him at all. And I especially don't like that he is pressed in front of us so much over another character who was my favorite. But I appreciated more the political plot lines. It wasn't perfect by any means. I was very entertained by it this time around. Next up is The Girl in the Stars by Mark Lawrence. This is a new trilogy in the same setting as his trilogy, The Book of the Ancestor. We talked about that with Grey Sister. I really, really love this setting. I am obsessed with it. It is a science fantasy world and there is a lot to unpack there, and I was so excited to read another series in this world. The Girl in the Stars follows a young woman named Yaz who, through a series of circumstances, ends up fighting for her life in the ice caverns below the polar ice. And I didn't love this one nearly as much as I loved the Book of the Ancestor books, partially because it is a YA and I just don't get on with YA anymore, and I just didn't love the characters as much, and I think there was just a little bit too much going on. I'm going to put this one in I was entertained because I love the setting and I will read any book in this setting and I will read anything by Mark Lawrence, but it definitely wasn't as strong as the Red Sister and Book of the Ancestor was. It was fine. Next up we have Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher, and this is a Sleeping Beauty retelling. It is a novella that follows the fairy godmother of the story, and she is living in a bog just trying to make sure that no one climbs that there tower. And while this has worked for centuries, she comes across a young knight who is determined to solve the mystery of this tower, and through their burgeoning friendship we learn about how this tower came to be there and who exactly is sleeping inside and why our fairy godmother is so desperate to keep everyone out. This one was fine, so this is gonna go in entertaining. It's a nice short read. Again, not my favorite of T. Kingfisher's work. I didn't hate it, but definitely entertaining. If you like fairy tale retellings and you like T. Kingfisher's writing, you'll probably like it too, but it wasn't groundbreaking by any stretch of the imagination. Next up, we have The Unmaking of June Farrow by Adrienne Young, and this is about a young woman named June Farrow who comes from a long line of women who are under this sort of curse where they all succumb to this peculiar sort of madness. And at the beginning of this book, June has just lost her grandmother and is dealing with the grief from that while also starting to experience symptoms of this madness as well. And she embarks on this journey to kind of solve the mystery of the curse and hopefully break it. This one I don't think was for me. I didn't really care for it. I thought that there were a few too many plot holes, and for me that was just a deal breaker. The magical realism is just the light touch that she took with the magical realism and just hand waving away any like questions you may have about it on the assumption that you're just going to be so compelled by the story and the characters that you're not going to care. That didn't work on me. I did care. I just had so many questions at the end. Like, I can't really say anymore without spoiling it. Truly, if you are intrigued by that, please go read it. But the plot holes were just killer for me. I think I gave this 2.5. Adrienne Young is known for having really, really beautiful writing, and that is certainly true in this book. But I think I just need a little bit more care and detail paid to the speculative elements than she did in this book. Next up, we have The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. This is the third and final installment of her Broken Earth trilogy, the first being the 5th season, which to me is one of the best fantasy books ever written. The Stone Sky wraps up this trilogy beautifully, giving every single character the ending that I wanted for them, truly. And I'm not exaggerating there. That every single character in this book got the ending I wanted for them. My only issue with it was the pacing was just a little bit off. Not really a lot happens in this book. This is more about an emotional journey that the characters are going on and explaining some of the background that we've been missing all this time. I love the trilogy overall, and like I said, the 5th season is truly one of the best books I've ever read. At the time that I read it, I say this and I've said this before and I will say it again, truly one of the most perfect books ever written. For this particular book, I just found it entertaining, and really only that because I loved the characters so much. We are almost through it, guys. Just 3 more books left. Next up is Winter Be My Shield by Jo Spurrier, and I don't really have a lot to say about this one because I DNF'd it. It was very, very boring. I'm gonna go ahead and put this in not for me. I had read 100 pages and almost nothing had happened. I felt absolutely no connection to the characters and had no conception of what the plot would be other than maybe a rebellion. Not for me. Maybe there's an audience out there for it. I don't really know because I have no idea what the plot was supposed to be at that point. Next up, we have What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This is a fantasy horror retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, which was one of my favorites when I was reading Poe as a teenager. There is a lot to love about this book. I particularly love the main character, Alex, and I love, again, T. Kingfisher's writing is always a banger. For this one, I don't know. I think I'm gonna put it in. This one's tough for me because the culprit at the crux of this mystery, central mystery, disappointed me. It is another one of those plot elements that I feel like I've read several times and I'm just sort of like over it. And even T. Kingfisher like made reference to that plot point being used before in her author's note at the end. So like I feel bad for calling it out since she like was feeling guilty for writing about it when it's been done before. So I was just like, oh, not again. Oh, not again. But I did like the main character. I did like kind of the spooky atmosphere, and the central mystery was entertaining right up until the very end. I think I am going to put it in I can't stop thinking about it because I cannot conceive of what the sequel is going to be, because it again is another one where it seemed really nicely wrapped up at the end. And I love our main character Alex Stern so much that I'm going to keep following them. I need to know what they're up to next. So I'm going to put this one I can't stop thinking about it, not because it was like my favorite, but because I just have to know what comes next for Alex Stern. And lastly, The Bear and the Nightingale. And y'all, this one was just not for me. I am so disappointed because this is such a beloved series, and it was one that I thought that I would really like. This is about a young girl named Vasya who is living in the Russian wilderness in the 13th century, and her whole life is turned upside down when her father remarries a young woman who brings with her a Christian priest who kind of makes it his mission to drive out reverence of the sort of older gods, older magical creatures that kind of have sustained Vasya's village since time immemorial. And that really upsets the balance and the ecosystem of this village, and Vasya takes it upon herself to maintain that balance. Catherine Arden's writing, she's another writer who is, you know, has really mastered her craft, but it truly was just not for me. I do not really care for the omniscient narrator. I prefer to be in third person close, and the jumping around that we did from POV to POV didn't work for me. I really do not like the Christian narrative, the Christian, like the religious parts of it. I really don't like it. I found the connection between Vasya and this magical being that kind of looms large over her life to be just a little bit creepy. So as much as I really did truly want to love this book because it is so beloved and it was very beautifully written, I am sad to say that this was just not for me. So this is my final ranking of the 22 books that I read and DNF'd in the first quarter of 2024. Please let me know in the comments where you landed on some of these books, if you agree with my rankings or if you disagree, if you have some thoughts that you'd like to share with me, if you want to tell me I am wrong and that The Bear and the Nightingale is perfect and I am just incorrect for not liking it, please tell me. I love to talk about books and I would love to talk about them with you. But that is everything for me from this video. In my next video, I'm going to be following up on my Camp NaNoWriMo writing goals with another writing vlog. I hope you look forward to it, and I will see you then.